That's your book there, right, Mark?
Sharon Person is professor at St. Louis Community College, St. Louis, Missouri, where she has taught English as a second language for 25 years. In 2007, she received an MA in history from the University of Missouri, St. Louis. She has written extensively and researched even more on St. Louis's colonial history and received as co-author from the State Historical Society of Missouri the award for the best book of 2015 for St. Louis Rising, the French regime of Louis Saint-Ange de Bellerive. Sorry. Sharon previously spoke at our 2016 Joint History Conference with the Center for French Colonial Studies on the topic Illegitimate Children of the Illinois Country. Today, Sharon will present Pierre Laclede in St. Genevieve. Please welcome Sharon Person. You gonna try that?
Hey, thank you all for staying. It's a long day, but I feel like I've learned so much. I'm very grateful to folks who put this all together and make it happen every year. And I'm particularly grateful you've all been so helpful in my time of trial here. So I'm talking about Pierre Laclede and St. Genevieve. I realize I'm the last presentation of the day, so I'm going to try to be real direct about what I'm telling you, okay? I'm going to talk about this document. I am not ranging over many decades or centuries of history. I'm pretty much confined to 3 or 4 years. This is a document that is here in the St. Genevieve archives. It is pretty much unknown, I would have to say, to historians of St. Louis. And I would think it would be more interesting because it has to do with Pierre Laclede. This is about the fur trade of the 1760s. And let me see. Okay, let me go ahead and I just wanted you to know that it's not real photogenic. You know, this is not, but I love this stuff. When you put the words together, there's an incredible little story going on here. This document was part of a litigation. I can see he's already trying to make it out. This document is part of a litigation, and like so many things like that, we don't exactly know how it ends yet. I have come up with an ending for my presentation, although I'm not really sure what it means. There are several significant, surprising elements of the situation here. This is the first page. It only goes a little bit onto a second page. Again, this document is a deposition, part of litigation. As far as I know, we know, Judge, you can weigh in here, it's the only testimony in a fur trade dispute where Indians were deposed. In this case, several Shawnee men, they traveled to St. Genevieve to give their deposition. In other words, we have Indian men participating in a French legal process in 1766. On Carl Eckberg's word, it's the only time that the signatures of 2 Canadian-born men so important for the Illinois country, Saint-Ange de Bellerive, commandant of the Illinois country up at St. Louis, and Francois Vallée, identified here as captain of the militia, the only time that their signatures may appear together. Again, it should be of some interest to people who admire Pierre Laclede just to know that he was here on this particular date in April 1766. And in fact, that's a project that Carl and I had, and much of what I'm talking about today comes from an article that we wrote several years ago. By the way, I need to update my Vita, sorry folks. I'm retired now, and that seems to be generally known. Everybody has congratulated me after 27 years of teaching English as a second language in St. Louis. Again, that leaves me more time to do my newfound passion here. Let me see. So it's a document that tells us something about Pierre Laclede, tells us something about the fur trade. And I will say right up front, Peter, that there is the perception, the popular perception, actually promoted by Laclede himself, that he utterly dominated the fur trade in the Illinois country, but there's really no documentary evidence to prove that. Very few records exist about Pierre Laclede in the fur trade, actually. And so the fact that this one is here in the St. Genevieve archives is even more extraordinary. Okay. So let me take you back to the mid-1760s. This is the map by Guy Dufossat, about 1767. This is St. Louis. By 1766, excuse me, St. Louis was taking shape under the government of Louis Saint-Onge de Bellerive, the commandant. The first official census, Carl had a nice image of that this morning, of the two West Side settlements was taken that spring. The population of St. Louis recorded at just over 300, including slaves. St. Genevieve, almost 550. So St. Genevieve was larger than St. Louis at this point in 1766. In March 1766 in St. Genevieve, the St. Louis royal judge, Lefebvre, and the notary, Leboussiere, came down to St. Genevieve to meet with Francois Vallée, and they drew up an agreement in which Vallée would furnish food and lodging for Indians who visited St. Genevieve. In St. Louis, in April 1766, the first known St. Louis fur trade contract was drawn up by the notary, and it did not involve Pierre Laclede. Next one. Oops. Yeah, this is what happens. I'm going to use my foot as an excuse several times. Go ahead. No, go ahead. That's just the image of the census, the St. Louis part. Carl showed you the St. Genevieve part. And of course, Saint-Onge is there first. Pierre Laclede is down a little bit further on the page. Okay. I want to go back a couple years again to the end of the French and Indian War, because it's my contention that it is the French and Indian War that forms the context for the beginnings of St. Louis, and had not too awful much to do with Pierre Laclede and Auguste Chouteau. So, spring 1766. The end of the war was a very confusing time, as the endings of wars can be. And so even though people tend to focus on the treaty of 1763, the time from 1759 until then was a time of great uncertainty. So the conduct resolution of the French and Indian War, as well as what we commonly call Pontiac's War, brought a lot of uncertainty about the future to settlers, and it brought them actually across the river to the west side of the Mississippi. So in September 1763, this is before Pierre Laclede ever arrived in this area, September 1763, there was an official declaration to the inhabitants of Fort Deschartres, and let me read a little bit of it. Oddly enough, the only place I have been able, that I found this document is in the British papers of Sir William Johnson. But it's the first time that I have ever seen this document. So, it is well decided that the King of France, the King of England, and King of Spain, undoubtedly affected with the horrors of such a long, long and bloody war, have at length made peace, whereof the definitive treaty was ratified the 4th of last March. It is by virtue of a letter with the King's seal that the governor, by his dispatches bearing the date the 13th of last July, gives me orders to deliver up this place, Fort Deschartres, to the commission of His Britannic Majesty, empowered by his orders for this purpose and to evacuate the same. I do not enter into a detail of this session. It is conformable to the article in the preliminaries concerning this quarter. and which we have seen, here we go, which leaves the inhabitants free and at liberty to retire wherever it seemeth good unto them. I don't know how that goes into French, but wherever it seemeth good unto them within the possessions of the three kings. He has then ordered me to acquaint all those who are willing to withdraw themselves herefrom and to propose to them New Orleans, the Allemand, La Pointe Coupé, there's a comma in there that I think doesn't belong, Arkansas, and St. Genevieve. So these are all places that the east side settlers in Kaskaskia, Fort Deschartres, were told that they might go. So it's great that St. Genevieve is on that list. So again, this is from Commandant Néon de Villiers at Fort Deschartres to the villagers there. Okay. Go ahead to the next one. So, looks a lot better on a small screen, sorry. This is one of the Balan maps, and I can't hop over there, but you can see the Missouri River and Fort Deschartres. You can see St. Genevieve is down there. So at the time, St. Genevieve was the only settlement of note on the west bank of the Mississippi. And of course, by 1763, the time of this announcement, St. Genevieve was already a thriving agricultural village. Now, I opened one of my authoritative books and got this piece of information, which Carl just shot to heck this morning, so I don't know if he's revised his own ideas, but Francois Vallée sold his house in Kaskaskia in 1754, and in 1755 he was identified as a resident of St. Genevieve in the marriage record of 2 slaves. So we'll just kind of skip right past that. But at any rate, again, placing Francois Vallée and his rise in St. Genevieve is very important, so that by the time Pierre Laclede came down here, Vallée was, again, the wealthiest person in the area. Okay, go ahead. So, the peace at the end of the French and Indian War involved the Indians of the area as well as the villagers. So Néon de Villiers at Fort Deschartres made this pronouncement to the villagers there, but he was also sending messages to Indians in all directions. Let me read you the list, those of you who follow where these folks are. The Iroquois, the Abenakis, the Shawnees, the Ottawas, Chippewas, Hurons, Potawatomis, Kickapoos, Mascoutins. I mean, he was covering everybody, okay? Miamis, Wiatanans, Piankashas, Illinois, the Sacs, Foxes, Osages, Kansas, Missouri, Penny, and to all red men. This letter was addressed. And there are several iterations of it. This is one. It was from a face-to-face council in September 1763, again at Fort Deschartres, with a group of Shawnee and Loup Indians who requested gunpowder and balls to take up arms against the British. Néon advised the Indians to gather their wives and children, cross the river to the west side, and bury the hatchet, it says bury the hatchet, to cease hostilities against the British. On the west side of the river, under the wings of the French, they would continue to receive their accustomed care. Again, this is September 1763, before the traditionally accepted founding date of St. Louis. So it is clear that all of the focus is moving to the west side of the Mississippi River. Okay. So I'm going to tell you what I know about the Shawnee Indians and their relation to St. Genevieve in the Illinois country. So in October 1763, Néon de Villiers was visited at Fort Deschartres by a Shawnee, Charlot Casquet. He was described as a sauvage francisé. In other words, he was raised in the Catholic religion. Casquet, the Shawnee, was an emissary from Pontiac. So he was bearing a belt from Pontiac, a communication that he was supposed to deliver to Fort Deschartres. And interestingly enough, just after this, Francois Vallée is identified as an intermediary for the Shawnee, carrying a belt of the Shawnee down to New Orleans to Dabadie, who at that time was the Director General. He was not called governor. Director General Dabadie. Francois Vallée had a relationship with these Shawnee Indians in the early 1760s. Next one. So for Pierre Laclede then, he joins our picture in August 1763, but in New Orleans. So midsummer 1763, the transitional government has arrived in New Orleans. Gilbert Antoine Maxent and a small group of businessmen saw economic opportunity in the winding down of the French administration of Louisiana. The basic information of the cession of the western part of Louisiana to Spain was known, though not announced through official ceremony yet. And Dabadie granted trading rights, the fur trade with the Indians, to a small number of trading partnerships. These partnerships spread around. They shared the risk of the Indian trade, and Maxent took 2 men into a société, a trading partnership, and those men were Laclede and Ledee. They tended to leave Ledee's name off of it, and you can see in the middle there, it just says Maxent, Laclede, and Company. This is the only document that is known to exist for this agreement. I found it in McDermott's papers in Edwardsville, and we can't figure out where it came from, but it's the only known agreement, copy of an actual document that shows their agreement. So my thinking is, after browsing through the wonderful Louisiana documents that are online, is that it was Laclede and Ledee knew each other, and somehow they hooked up with Maxent, because Laclede and Ledee are witnesses together at a couple marriages. One of them, Ledee, seemed to be friends with a merchant out of Martinique. So these are good connections to have. So Ledee was the third partner with Maxent and Laclede. Okay, let me see. These partnerships were almost always temporary by design. They lasted for 1 trading season, 2, or even 3. And Dabadie in New Orleans proposed 3-year renewable permits in the summer of 1763. Next one. Above all, Pierre Laclede was a skilled self-promoter, and I don't necessarily mean that in a bad way. I think that the Illinois country needed self-promoters at this time. Regarding his business acumen, he owned the best how-to guides at the time, as the collection of books in his library demonstrated, and this was one of them. By the way, he also had that book about the Jardin Potager. This is one of the books that he owned, and an edition, a similar edition of this, describing how to be a perfect merchant. But the best guides for merchants written in France likely had limited relevance to the fur trade in the Illinois country. So the typical way that the fur trade was conducted was very often, and judge, anybody, jump in, was to draw up a contract, a notarial contract that specified who was going, some of the terms, when the payment in furs was expected. Sometimes the types of furs were specified in these fur trade contracts. That was the normal way of doing business. Let me see. In Laclede's inventory, there was a ledger book, an account book for the business of Laclede, Maxent and Company. Its starting date was November 11th, 1763. I think that was just after the Jesuit auction. And the next week after that, November 19th, Laclede purchased with a notarial agreement the établissement that he would use at Fort de Chartres for the next couple years. Next. Okay. This is an item from the estate papers of Pierre Laclede. So again, trying to figure out where he was and what he was doing in these early years where there are not a lot of documents. This says that it doesn't say that this is fur trade merchandise, but this is a typical amount for fur trade merchandise. So Pierre Laclede gave to one Lalande, in all likelihood that Jean-Baptiste Lalande in Kaskaskia, on the 6th of December, 1763, this sum of merchandise. So this, in 1763, again, he was beginning to set up his trading. All right. I want to interject a couple of searingly ignorant comments about Pierre Laclede. This is a statement that is from his inventory. These are debts that were uncollected at his death. And unfortunately, that's about all we have to go on to try to figure out what he was doing and who he was working with. So one person noted, and I have not bothered to follow this up, so this is a paraphrase, that Pierre Laclede died with overwhelming debt because he was generous to the point of fault and shared his prosperity with people who needed help. That kind of borders on the silly to me. The second comment was made by somebody who should know better, in response to Carl's and my assertion that Pierre Laclede may not have dominated the fur trade in those days. And the comment was that, well, a businessman would not generate documents. There would not be a paper trail for someone who was a businessman. I know. Can you? It's in print. That one I can show you, and I won't tell you who said it. So fur trade contracts that were drawn up before a notary had been routine for decades. They're in the Kaskaskia manuscripts. No one would just give merchandise to traders without something on paper. So this was a BA, a note saying that Lalande had owed this money that he got in merchandise from Laclede on December 6, 1763. Now that's an interesting date because, of course, if you follow the Chateau Journal story about the founding of St. Louis, supposedly that was when he was in St. Louis marking trees. So that's kind of just a little interesting side. This is the question I think I was going to ask you. It is entirely possible, I think, that Laclede may have done business with these small exchange notes and did not bother with full notarial contracts. And next one. This is one of my favorite notes. Somewhere there you can see the date. I could use my crutches as a pointer. 1771. This is a note from one trader to another trader made out in the Pawnee village on the Missouri. I mean, they were obsessive about keeping track of who gave what to whom and how much it was worth and how it would be repaid. So again, even, don't try. Mimi's trying to read it. This is my article about the fur traders out in Nebraska. Again, next one. People kept records. Here's another one. This is a record. This is probably written by Berard, Antoine Berard. So this is a statement, you owe me this money. This happens to be money that the interpreter owed to Pierre Laclede. And Madame Chateau is included up there at the top. So the interpreter owed this money to Pierre Laclede, minus the couple of days that he spent looking for Laclede's runaway slave and a couple of horses that he castrated. I mean, incredible detail in some of these things, right? So again, this sense that we are missing information about.
Would you mind speaking more into the microphone?
I am very sorry.
You keep
You're right.
drifting off.
Sorry about that. Will do. I have exactly the same complaint about people who lose the ends of their sentences. Again, this is a record of a debt of the interpreter to Madame Chouteau and Pierre Laclede. So it's detailed, it's neat. Next one. Jean-Baptiste Sarpi was one of the neatest and most diligent in his accounts. And so you can see this is the account for one person. And he has the date on the left that the debt was incurred and what the person bought and a little bit of information. So the idea that someone who did business would not keep any kind of official records, paper records for us to look at is kind of silly in addition. Okay, next one. So here we are back with our document. And by April 1766, again, just to get you back into that time, the British were installed by this time at Fort de Chartres. And that meant that the trading year from 1765 to 1766 may have been kind of confused, and it was right in the middle of that this incident happened. I think a lot of things remain to be sorted out. So it's entirely likely that British, French, and Spanish boundaries in the fur trade, and whether they were French or Spanish, had not yet, these issues had not yet sorted themselves out. But there's no doubt that the Shawnee Indians were east of the Mississippi River, and that was British territory. Some of the Shawnee groups, however, remained fiercely devoted to the French. In a speech in New Orleans in December 1764, our friend Charlot Casquet complained to Dabadie, "The French no longer come to the Shawnee to trade, and he begged, send us traders, we shall pay them well, we are rich in peltry. Our wives and children are all naked since the French come no more to trade in the nation. If we see the French in our homes, our hearts will be content." Again, this is 1764, the war's finished, but things have not yet settled. Dabadie promised that he would send traders to the Shawnee, and a few weeks later Dabadie died, and his replacement, Captain Charles-Philippe Aubry, repeated this promise because he reported at the same time the Indians still were not allowing the British to travel to Fort de Chartres. So whether these pleas by Casquet were approximate cause for Laclede's adventure with the Shawnee Indians is unknown. But this is what happened. So in the 1765 trading cycle, Laclede provided merchandise, trade merchandise, to 3 men, and they're only named, I have their names down at the bottom there, Antaya, Baptiste Charlot, and Potvin. The only name that's helpful there is Baptiste Charlot. Antaya might have been the father, Antoine Pelletier d'Antaya, might have been one of his sons, Antoine or Michel. I think it's possible that the merchandise was actually given to Antaya, and he in turn hired Baptiste Charleville and Potvin to go to the Shawnee Indians. So let me see. Again, this is not a fur trade contract. This is part of the litigation. So what happened was that Laclede gave the merchandise to Antaya, or to all 3 of them. The traders went to the Shawnee village where they were supposed to go. Again, the exact location is not given here, but the Shawnee villages lay east in British territory. Laclede had thrown his lot in with the French very clearly, right? So we don't know the exact goods. They're not enumerated here. 1769 shipment by Maxent to the Illinois country for the trade included typical things like blankets, beads, guns, powder, lead balls, kettles, shirts, vermilion. Later inventories of trade goods included silver items. What do I have next? That is really cool. You can see the next slide there. Thank you. This is the well-known image of a Shawnee Indian from the late 1700s, and this is a bracelet that is in the Smithsonian Museum of the American Indian, owned by the Shawnee, but from the 1700s. So this is a bracelet. So whether these things were in that merchandise, we don't know. So the traders took their merchandise, went out to the Shawnee village, and instead of trading for furs, they bought sexual favors from the Shawnee women. And that's what the Shawnee men came to attest to in St. Genevieve. And let me see. So when the traders came back, they were a little bit short of the furs they needed to pay Laclede, and this set up this extraordinary tableau in the document. Can you go backwards? Sure. Great, okay, thanks. Again, these traders may have been in Kaskaskia. Kaskaskia was now British, but Laclede was looking for some justice, and maybe that was to be had in French St. Genevieve. Okay, pardon me. So, Laclede up in St. Louis gathered St. Ange de Bellerive. Again, it was unusual for St. Ange, I think, to travel down to St. Genevieve. This is Cabazier's handwriting and spelling. So it was not the usual notary, Le Bouxier, so it was the St. Genevieve notary. They proceeded to Valais with an interpreter. Now, I believe the interpreter was very likely, those of you who know these early names, Marc Constantineau, who had been in the Shawnee villages for 6 years and met his wife, who was a slave there, purchased her and brought her to St. Genevieve. So we had a male and a female Shawnee speakers right here available in St. Genevieve, and that's who I believe their interpreter was. The handwriting is almost impossible to read, so that's a guess of mine. And in fact, so Valais had this connection with the Shawnee, but he also had these two people here in St. Genevieve, and that's a strong reason, perhaps, for this whole incident to take place in St. Genevieve. The Shawnee men attested that, in fact, the traders had frittered away the merchandise with libertinage, with the women, and that they had protested, but the men had not stopped. And there was another trader who just happened to be in the same Shawnee village, and he also reproached the young men for their behavior, and they did not stop. And so that's about as much as this document tells us. Okay, and then I hurt my foot. So we're gonna wing it for the rest of this. Keep going. Yeah, next, okay, so here are the signatures on the last page. And to people who love the documents, much as our last speaker had those great maps, love it, the signatures here are amazing. So first you see St. Ange and Valais, and Pierre Laclede did not sign this document. He didn't need to. So the witnesses, let me see, there's a mark in the middle. The cross is that other French trader who had been in the village with them. Interesting to see that Dacherut signed this record. Now, if you know the story of the seizure by Pierre Laclede of the goods of Dacherut and Viviat, that had happened a little bit before this, the year before this, so that was still in litigation. Dacherut was trying to get his things back. So you kind of wonder why some of these signatures might be here. It's kind of like, I'm watching you. So I think that may be. But also, legitimately, Dacherut would have had information about the normal goings-on in the fur trade. And so his signature there is probably significant. But there's another signature here that I find intriguing. So we have St. Ange, we have Valais, and then to the right of Valais, there's a signature Dutillet. And this is a former captain in the French Marines. He was out of New Orleans. He seems to have come up to the Illinois country in 1765, participated in the trade. He and Laclede had together given some merchandise to a couple of traders in a contract. So Laclede's name comes up occasionally, and in this case, it's in conjunction with this former Marine Captain Dutillé. And the interesting thing about Dutillé is that he died a couple months after this document was signed. And so in the process of trying to collect the money that was due to Dutillé, we have the names of several traders from 1765. And again, these are like those golden years to me because there are so few documents from that time. So Dutillé and Laclede had worked together. He was somebody from New Orleans. He returned to New Orleans and may have died somewhere along the way, or even possibly in St. Genevieve, I'm not sure. Okay, what's next?
Looks like somebody signed for Valley there. That's
Oh, you're right.
well,
You're right. Yeah. Okay. So again, trying to puzzle out Pierre Laclede's trading history in those early years from 1763 to 1765, 66. The only way that we can learn about them are from the uncollected debts that remained in his 1778 estate inventory. And this is a very unexplored issue with Pierre Laclede, and I might come up with an article about it in the next year or so. So from 1764, he had uncollected debts of 31,000 livres. A nice stone house, thank you, could be bought, purchased, contracted for at that time with 2,000 livres. So that's a village worth of stone houses that he lost. These are uncollected debts. We don't know about the ones that he actually got back. From 1765, seems he had a better year, just 6,000 livres, and in 1766, again, 35,000, more than 35,000 livres of uncollected debts. And that's not to say he was a bad businessman. He was taking huge risks, as you can see. He was providing merchandise to traders who were going off to trade with British Indians in British territory, and what should he do when there was a problem? It was a difficult situation. So I don't mean to demean his trading acumen by any means, but he definitely was taking the risks for the company, and he lost big. So here is our Pierre Laclede, next one. And his spirit is still Go ahead. So here's my ending. This little incident with the traders out to the Shawnee Indians took place in 1765, 1766. In 1769, Baptiste Charleville, one of those who had his fun with the Shawnee women, got married in Kaskaskia, and guess who was a witness? Pierre Laclede shows up as a witness for the groom. I don't know what that means. But I looked really, really hard at this page of signatures, and he did not sign the contract. Again, marriage contracts often contain names of relatives, people who have a stake in the financial marital community. And I just have to wonder if again, Pierre Laclede was there because he said, I'm watching you. But that's just a guess on my part. And then he left before the party started, I guess. Thank you.
So we have come to the end of an especially illuminating and interesting day. A couple of announcements before we go. Some thank yous to the staff of the St. Genevieve Community Center. They are very easy to work with. To the St. Genevieve TV folks who are here. To Jack. As secretary to the foundation, Jack Ketting does a lot of things, including registration for the conference, but he also orders and picks up all the food. So thank you for that, Jack. Thank you to the food chairman, my friend Janet Leonard, who is back there, and she was chairman for the reception and for breakfast and for lunch. So she's had triple duty. And thanks especially to Susie for helping her. Thanks. Thanks to Bob Mueller for putting together an especially outstanding slate of speakers for this year, as always. Thank you, Bob. Nice. And certainly thank you to all of the presenters today. It's been a spectacular day. I want to remind you all that you have a save the date for next year, and it will be September the 19th. The conference is not yet over, because tomorrow, if you wish, there is a church tour starting at noon. It will include the Catholic Church, and then the Lutheran Church, and the Antoine O'Neill House, which is the most recent and most spectacular preservation and renovation of a house that was in great peril. So you really want to see that. If you would like, stop by the Audubons this evening. People will be there being social. And I encourage two things. Don't leave without a cookie, and don't leave without leaving your name tag, and we will recycle it. Bob, do you have anything else? Oh, thank you all very much. Especially thank you to the speakers, and we'll see you all next year.